Welcome again. In this lecture in our new Principles of Economics series, we will look at institutions and their evolution.
As it turns out, this is a very broad topic that has been tackled by various disciplines, including economics. We will offer an approach that takes up core topics of the economic perspective, in particular the role of incentives, transaction cost, and path dependency, but significantly enlarge this by taking a broader look at cognitive mechanisms related to institutions, performativity, and the role of power and violence.
Here is our agenda. Based on the vast existing literature, institutions have been defined in different and partly ambiguous ways. So we provide a brief review and then offer our own synthesis. We then discuss what accounts for the following of institutions, including cognitive and emotional mechanisms. Building on that, we develop an account of institutions as performative phenomena, building on a circular model of institutional development that was originally created by the economist Masahiko Aoki. An important implication of performativity is path dependence, which we discuss together with different categories of cost of institutions. Finally, we tackle an issue that tends to be underemphasized in the economics of institutions, namely the role of power and violence. In this context, we will also discuss how institutions can be evaluated.
What are institutions then? Two large classes of definitions can be distinguished. One focuses on patterns of regular factual behavior, such as the observation that drivers in Germany regularly exceed the speed limit by 10 to 20%. The other focuses on institutions as rules that govern this behavior, such as the German law enshrining this speed limit. To clearly delineate the two, we suggest the term institutionalized behavior for the factual pattern, while the term institution refers to the generating forces of this behavior, which can include standard formal rules, as well as the self-reinforcement of social practices.
But this is still very general, isn't it?
That is why we distinguish four categories of institutions, or forces generating institutionalized behavior, roughly along the ways of enforcing them, reaching from self-enforcing conventions to formal institutions that are subject to enforcement by specialized organizations. Let us look at each of them in turn.
Conventions are self-enforcing social rules. External enforcement is not necessary here, because the payoff structure incentivizes even self-interested agents to follow the convention. An example would be practice for pedestrians to walk on the right hand of a sidewalk. Keeping the convention renders moving ahead easier for each individual, while any kind of sanctioning is virtually absent in this case. Since all institutionalized behavior is a form of strategic interaction, we can refer them to the different canonical games that we have analyzed in Chapter 5. A game theoretic reference for conventions is the coordination game.
Social norms are value-driven expressions of identity that are additionally enforced by mutual sanctions in a group, such as moral aggression against norm violators. An example are norms of honesty and trustworthiness in ethnic trading communities such as of Jewish or Chinese origin. The norms are value-laden, possibly in a religious context, and their breach would be sanctioned by in-group mechanisms such as ostracism. The game theoretic reference is the Battle of the Sexes and the stag hunt.
Informal institutions, in contrast, are not necessarily value-based and involve status-based third-party enforcement. Think of resource-sharing norms in a traditional village community that are enforced by the village elders. The relevant game theoretic reference here can be the stag hunt as well as the prisoner's dilemma.
Finally, there are formal institutions, namely rules that are written down in formalized documents and enforced by specialized third-party organizations. The standard example here, of course, are laws. The main game theoretic reference is again the prisoner's dilemma. Didn't we come across the differentiation between formal and informal social structures before?
Indeed, we did. In chapter 8, where we differentiated between formal and informal networks in organizations.
Let us now turn to the mechanisms that underlie the establishment, following, and stabilisation of institutions. In principle, we can distinguish various dimensions here. For example, the individual versus population level, cognitive and emotional aspects, and the element of time. We will start here with the cognitive mechanisms that we regard as key for the institutionalization of behavior. This institutionalization is conceived here as a circular closure of mutually enhancing cognitive operations. Let us go through this step by step.
We look at a series of actions depicted in clockwise order by the dashed circle here that generate certain outcomes. As we've seen in chapter 7, the predictive brain constantly forms expectations about these outcomes and adapts its decisions on behavior accordingly. The question now is how these adaptations lead to institutionalized behavior and the stabilization of institutions over time.
We distinguish three key mechanisms here. The first is induction in connection with the so-called Gestalt principle. The Gestalt principle refers to the completion of fragmentary perceptions of larger patterns, such as recognizing an object while just seeing parts of it. This also applies to the time dimension. That is, the extrapolation of fragmented information about an unfolding behavior to a familiar pattern. The Gestalt principle is closely related to framing effects, which are well known in economics. Given some triggers or cues on a certain situation, agents will frame it according to a well-known pattern. Cues may relate to individual behavior, such as body language, often associated with a material environment, such as official symbols.
Let us apply this to an informal institution that is highly relevant for economic development, namely corruption. The institutionalization of corruption is by no means an evident process, since most of the times, after all, it stands in contradiction to established formal institutions. So, imagine I meet a corrupt tax officer for the first time and observe a cue that indicates the expectation of a bribe, such as an indirect verbal hint or a body gesture. Given the contradiction to the formal institutional framework, I will possibly be surprised by the cue, but adapt my behavior. That is, I pay the bribe. Next time I encounter the tax officer, I will pay the bribe immediately. Thus, the Gestalt mechanism has led me to expectation that this particular tax officer is corrupt, and it may eventually lead to expectations about other tax officers as well.
This leads to the second mechanism, namely the establishment of hypotheses building on abduction. Abduction is essentially a cognitive process that seeks plausible explanations for observations. These explanations are then condensed into hypotheses. In our case, hypotheses about behavioral regularities. As before, hypotheses result in expectations that can be confirmed or refuted by subsequent actions and their outcomes.
In the example of corruption, the relevant hypothesis is that all tax officers behave in a corrupt way on a regular basis. Or in other words, that there is a rule to bribe whose non-compliance will be sanctioned.
Institutionalization, then, essentially emerges when these hypotheses are recurrently confirmed. This implies a cognitive categorization of involved types of actions and contexts, which, through always exhibiting a certain amount of variance, is stable over time.
So in the case of corruption, we would then see a regularized interaction of the concerned actors based on the informal institution. But do these cognitive mechanisms really cover the whole story of institutionalization?
Clearly, the picture is more complex. One aspect that we have left out so far is the role of emotions. This comes in different forms. First, some institutions have biological roots and therefore are undergirded by respective emotional mechanisms. A key example is possession and property, which can be traced back to the universal human strive for territoriality.
Second, emotions strongly influence the following of institutions as well as the interplay between the four categories of institutions that we have defined. In particular, formal institutions on the one hand and informal institutions and social norms on the other. Think again of our example of corruption. For example, a strong culture of civil servant discipline or high general spirit of public order may lead to the sanctioning of tax office or citizens engaging in corrupt behavior and therefore block institutionalization. In this case, emotions would in fact become a key supporter of the alignment of formal and informal institutions.
The same point can also be made in a different context, namely the stability of authoritarian systems. This may be undergirded by emotionally loaded social norms that are authoritarian as well, such as, for example, in family life or education.
Finally, an important mediator between emotions and institutions is ritual. There are many examples of formal institutions that combine with ritual actions, such as in the announcement of a court decision. This directly leads to the question of performativity, to which we turn next.
In our initial distinction of four categories of institutions, we stressed enforcement as a key differentiating criterion. This implicitly assumes a divergence of individual interests and the collective stabilization of an institution, such as epitomized in the prisoner's dilemma in the simplest way, and is in line with a traditional economic incentives-based view of institutions. However, this assumption ignores the fact that many institutions cannot be separated from the identity of their agents, or in other words, that institutions are performed by internalized behavior.
As a simple example, think of a soccer player. It is only the internalization of following the rules of the game that actually constitutes the role of the player. In this case, the role of external sanctions, although not entirely eliminated, is greatly reduced.
This is important because performativity eventually results in the formation of types of agents relating to certain institutional contexts. Many economic roles are shaped by processes of self-selection, which can partly be related to education. Not everyone aspires to become a CEO, and not everyone enrolls in an MBA program. So, certain types of agents will be overrepresented in those roles, or even become fully congruent with them.
We discussed a similar idea in Chapter 2. There, we mentioned in the context of reflexivity that economic and management students have been shown to behave more egotistically and rationally than students of other fields.
And egotistical behavior can in fact be actively incentivized by institutionalized design. Think of corporate governance concepts, in particular managerial compensation systems, which heavily rely on pecuniary incentives. Here, performativity means that the institution shifts the distribution of types of agents, which become more similar to the assumptions of the underlying theory, ultimately strengthening the institution.
A similar logic can be applied to the issue of gender discrimination for top executive positions. Such positions still tend to be tailored to male-oriented role models, such as status-oriented behavior, a positive attitude to workaholism, which leads to self-selection of females towards other careers. This again contributes to the stabilisation of the institutionalized behavior that is typically associated with CEOs.
Besides self-selection, strategic behavior plays an important role here as well. Expectations on behavior typical for agent types will lead reasonable individuals to adopt matching behavior. That is not only beneficial to them, but also minimizes coordination failure.
So we see that performative institutional arrangements in markets, in fact, organize the heterogeneity of agents in different dimensions. This has significant effects on the balance between individual and social preferences in different domains, and ultimately, the degree of cooperation in society and markets. A related aspect is the treatment of economic inequality, to which we will return in chapter 15. And of course, this heterogeneity is itself subject to evolution. For example, recent market developments have often promoted a type of market agent that exclusively focuses on the financial aspects of market transactions, undercutting previously accepted limits to market practices, such as in the health sector.
Let us now synthesize these elements into a more general model of the emergence and stabilization of institutions, which mainly builds on the work of Japanese economist Masahiko Aoki. Again, we distinguish different mechanisms that are connected in a circular process, here in clockwise order.
We consider a causal process of behavioral dispositions, strategic actions, recursive states of play, and sign systems. Those elements can be organized along two pairs of dimensions. First, we have a distinction between the behavioral and the cognitive dimensions. And second, we distinguish the individual from the population level.
Starting with behavioral dispositions, we have already discussed their cognitive and emotional origins earlier in this lecture. Think of a disposition to respect another person's property of a piece of land, for example, by avoiding to trespass a respective boundary. As we have said, this can be based on both cognitive factors, for example, the repeated confirmation of a hypothesis on negative consequences of trespassing, and emotional factors, for example, the propensity to territoriality.
Behavioral dispositions lead to action, which is strategic in the sense that it relies on a perceived structure of payoffs in the different game theoretic contexts that we have discussed. In the property case, this is likely related to individual expectations of sanctions for deviant behavior, both in a formal and informal sense. As we've seen, strategic actions also have a performative character in the sense of shaping the institution itself.
It is important to recognize that behavioral dispositions are propensities in the stochastic sense. A large majority of people may respect the property boundary, but a minority will not. This implies that the recursive states of play that result from strategic actions on the population level form a probability distribution of observable behavioral patterns. The interdependence of individual strategic behavior and population level outcomes shapes equilibria of institutionalization. in our example, respecting the property. But it is also key for understanding frequency-dependent institutional change. In our example, some trigger might disturb the incidence of property violations to a critical mass that eventually causes the breakdown of the institution itself.
This leads to the last element in our chain, namely the role of science systems, which is a generalization of the notion of cues that we have used earlier before. An institutional equilibrium regularly includes the production of signs or public representations that embody the institutionalized behavior. Sign systems compress information in the sense that they support the following of an institution without the concerned individual having full information about it. In our property example, the no trespassing sign that we have already depicted conveys a simple rule without the individual having to know, for example, which sanctions precisely a breach of the rule would generate. In that sense, science systems manifest what we call distributed cognition. Essentially, human brains are linked via material mediators that support the achievement of cognitive functions, such as reaching a common interpretation of a certain rule.
Distributed cognition is an example for the importance of material artifacts for cultural and biological evolution, which we already stressed in Chapter 4. Indeed, it is easy to frame our model in the general evolutionary logic of the variation, selection, retention mechanism, laying the ground for a general evolutionary theory of institutions. Behavioral dispositions include variation, which is then subject to selection on the population level, such as in the form of sanctions or via the workings of frequency-dependent mechanisms. The generation of signs assumes the general function of retention, similar to encoding biological information in genetic endowments. For example, formal institutions enshrined in legal texts are societal repositories of past knowledge, accumulating in the context of practicing the institution of property in society.
We have now laid out a quite extensive model of how institutions emerge and stabilize. But can we say more about specific patterns of how they develop? And of course, the effects they have on the economy and markets?
Well, as we will show in the following chapters, we indeed regard markets as institutions, or more precisely, institutionalized networks themselves. The same is true for money as the key medium of markets and the institutions of finance that are organized around it. On the effects of more specific institutions, such as property in the Western sense, we would certainly reject any simplistic accounts, such as that the presence of this institution is a necessary condition for economic development. As our examples have shown, the different categories of institutions always interact and therefore have to be seen in a holistic manner.
And that is one of the key reasons for what is commonly called the path dependence or hysteresis in institutional development. Institutions exhibit inertia over time. Radical change is costly and factually rare. And institutional transfer, for example, from one economy to the other, is fraught with uncertain outcomes.
In our previous example of corruption, experience has shown that anti-corruption initiatives only work as concerted action, involving the setup of new formal institutions with strong enforcement. Such action may eventually give rise to frequency-dependent change if a sufficient mass of people adapts their strategic actions and eventually their behavioral dispositions. But this is in no way a necessary outcome, given that the cognitive elements that we have scrutinized before are likely to generate a very high amount of inertia.
We can also frame these phenomena in terms of the network effects that we have already encountered in Chapter 6. Institutions complement each other, both in the terms of their categories and the different groups that are performing them. Think again of our example of property. We clearly see complementarity between the formal institution of property law and the informal institutional social norms regarding the acceptance of property-based boundaries. But we also have a complementarity between, say, the owners and the police and courts as enforcers of the formal institution. The emergence of a jurisprudence on property law, as well as a code of conducts or habits of police enforcement, add further layers of inertia to the institution.
Some economists have hypothesized that the direction of institutional evolution points towards more efficiency. That is essentially a minimization of transaction cost. Can we validate this in our framework?
Certainly not in this simplicity, but it does show the need to have a closer look at the cost of institutions. Here is our framework. We distinguish the cost of transactions as governed by the relevant formal and informal institutions, that is, economic transaction costs, and the costs of creating and maintaining these institutions, which we refer to as political transaction cost. On the political level, we treat the cost of creating and maintaining a constitution as a separate category.
From this scheme, we can immediately derive that it is the interplay of different levels, rather than just economic transaction cost, that ultimately determines the path of institutional evolution. Also, the implicit assumption of many economic analyses that they are institutions free of transaction cost does not make sense. There is simply no such institution. Therefore, we cannot have an objective third-person reference point for determining and eventually minimizing transaction cost. Rather, institutions and transactions are inextricably enmeshed. And in analyzing transaction cost, we can only start from a certain point in time and then look at changes of the different transaction cost categories. Here then we will see frequently reductions in one dimension and increases in another. Ultimately, therefore, a holistic principle applies, which corresponds to our earlier result with respect to path dependence.
On this basis, let us start in bottom-up fashion with economic transaction cost. In general terms, this covers the cost of preparing and acting and monitoring transactions. A main driver is uncertainty. Correspondingly, there is an important differentiation between ex ante transaction cost, such as the formulation of a contract and its coverage of contingencies, and ex post transaction cost, such as monitoring contractual performance. Clearly, the two stand in a trade-off relationship. We can minimize ex post transaction costs if we formulate complete contracts that are straightforward to enforce. However, this requires a considerable investment in ex ante transaction costs. An optimal contract would define a minimum of the aggregate costs. But there is a problem that the ex post cost is unknown. Thus, the aggregate result remains indeterminate.
These considerations already show that there are principal objections against the hypothesis that institutional evolution is driven by a minimization of economic transaction cost. Another issue is that a reduction of economic transaction cost in one realm may be achieved via externalization to another realm. For example, the institution of limited liability arguably reduces economic transaction cost. Take, for instance, lowered due diligence requirements for investors, or the reduced need for complex contracts. On the other hand, it partly externalizes the cost of risk-taking to society. Think of the cost of social welfare payments or bailouts that may follow a bankruptcy. Now, which of the costs is driving institutional evolution? The reduced transaction cost or the cost of externalizing risk? There's no general answer to this question. But does that mean that transaction cost is irrelevant in this context?
No. It just means that its impact on institutional evolution is always mediated by the perception of involved actors. That is, the second-person view. A definition of transaction costs as commensurable and objectified measure of the cost of institutions from a third-person view is not possible. An important consequence of that is, again, path dependency and possible divergence of institutional evolution.
Let us now turn to political transaction cost. We can distinguish three categories here, namely the cost of understanding and analyzing institutions and their effects, the cost of running them, and the cost of negotiating and agreeing on institutions. Let us start with the first category. Can the cost of understanding and analyzing institutions be objectified as some effort to arrive at an optimal institutional result?
It cannot, because such an optimization would imply full knowledge about the link between institutions and economic performance in a third-person perspective, which is again impossible. Empirically, there are many examples for the contested character of this link. Think of the introduction of stricter patent regimes that we have seen in many countries over the last decades and whose economic effects remain unclear.
In this context, institutional transfer and imitation can be regarded as a shortcut for the analysis of institutions and play an important role in institutional evolution. The results may be subject to institutional competition as a subcase of group selection. But, as we have seen in both chapters 3 and 4, significant leeway for variety is likely to remain. Therefore, by necessity, all hypotheses on the effects of institutional transfers remain confined to the second-person view, and institutional efficiency is mediated by actors' subjective perceptions.
The complexity of the institutional performance link is related to a characteristic of institutions that we have already stressed, namely their holistic character. That leads to another category of political transaction cost, namely the cost of running an institution, which in the case of formal institutions is mainly constituted by the cost of enforcement. This can become a significant determinant of performance. Think again of the patent example. Transferring a sophisticated patent regime from a highly developed to a less developed country might lead to misallocation and waste of scarce administrative resources, given the lack of qualified specialists and eventually complementary informal institutions such as a principal respect for those intellectual property rights.
An important conclusion from this is that there is no necessary connection between the level of economic and political transaction cost. For example, the reduction of economic transaction cost may be associated with an increase of political transaction cost for ensuring effective enforcement. As we have already stressed, modern legal systems are very costly in terms of maintaining the government bureaucracy, the court system, and others.
Let us now turn to the cost of negotiating and agreeing on institutions. Here, the distinction between constitutional level and other formal institutions becomes important. In economics and related philosophical approaches, the constitutional level relates to the construct of the social contract, sometimes called a contractarian approach. The idea is that autonomous individuals behind a so-called veil of ignorance about their future status are assumed to adopt a general set of rules that they can all agree upon. However, the transaction costs of finding unanimous agreement may be prohibitively high. The alternative of majority voting decreases this cost, but again raises a problem of externalization of the cost of decisions, in this case, to the dissenting minority.
Given what we have said about the problems of analyzing institutions above, negotiations about institutions by necessity take place in a situation of fundamental uncertainty. This implies leeway for influencing the negotiator's perception of their interest and eventually organizing them. Since this is costly, it can ultimately lead to results that favor well-organized minorities. As an example, think of the well-known result in the political economy of international trade, that well-organized import competing industries, like in our picture, the Swiss agricultural industry, can prevail over more dispersed consumer interests in terms of protectionist measures, although those are clearly inefficient from an economic point of view. This is because for these industries, the transaction cost of interest group formation are relatively lower compared to the benefits of success.
Overall, we can conclude that the normative application of the contractarian approach does not resolve the problem of indeterminacy in real-world scenarios of institutional choice. Similar to the results of the previous section, we cannot assume that institutional evolution follows an objectively determined trajectory of costs and benefits balanced over all concerned parties. This conclusion is reinforced by the fact that many institutions are in fact imposed by force and eventually violence. Let us turn to this issue now.
Institutions involve power in two ways. First, they assign and allocate agential power to individuals. And second, asymmetry of power is necessary for making sanctions work that enforce institutions. The first perspective is most visible in a core institution that we have already discussed, namely property. Property rights assign exclusive agential power over certain assets to specific individuals or groups. They thus create agential power in a double meaning. On the one hand, owners achieve autonomy in deciding about how they use their rights. On the other hand, they can rely on sanctioning mechanisms that protect their rights against interference from others, or mostly the third-party enforcement of formal institutions, that is, police and court action based on respective laws. However, this is often costly, such that reliance on other, more informal sanctioning mechanisms may dominate, leading back to the holistic principle that we already discussed.
Clear assignments of agential powers are of crucial significance for the operations of markets. This is to an important extent an issue of transaction costs, since diffused agential powers may cause tensions and conflicts in all stages of transactions. For example, institutions of corporate governance regulate agential powers of various parties engaged in a corporation, such as shareholders and management.
As we have already seen in the previous chapter, however, the factual distribution of agential power may deviate significantly from institutional assignments. Think of a monopoly. Here, both sides may have equal agential power as defined by formal institutions, but in fact, since one side has very restrained alternative choices, the other side can impose less beneficial conditions of exchange. We have already analyzed in detail that capacity specificity is a major factor in determining this relationship. The party with a higher degree of specificity will always have fewer choices and may therefore be forced to accept less beneficial conditions of exchange. Accordingly, aside from institutions, agential power is always influenced by the structure of social networks, specialization patterns, and the original allocation of assets and related agential powers.
How are institutions related to physical violence then? We find a paradox here. On the one hand, institutions are the major means to regulate and pacify endemic violent conflict over the allocation of resources. On the other hand, violence, or at least its threat, is indispensable for effective enforcement. In modern economies, the necessary capacity for violence is concentrated in specific groups, such as the police or the military. These groups have a large capacity to shape institutions in their interests of extracting resources. Resource extraction by the military, for example, may lead to so-called limited access orders, in which the economy is deeply divided into an elite stratum and the general population lacks access to essential political and economic assets.
In this case, institutionalized power positions and the institutional efficiency would likely stand in conflict. But this is not necessarily the case, in particular when power elites exhibit an interest in appropriating economic gains. Here we have another argument why authoritarian regimes can align well with the market economy, in addition to the point on values that we made in the previous chapter. Think of Taiwan and South Korea after World War II and Singapore to the present day as key examples.
Let us now turn to the last topic of this lecture, namely the evaluation of institutions. Is it possible to rank institutions according to their economic efficiency in a third-person view? This approach is mostly associated with economics. Our upper graph shows a country ranking with respect to an aggregate indicator of product market regulation developed by the OECD, with the message that a higher level of regulation is less efficient. Another simpler example that we already came across is the tariff, which most economists will see as inferior to a free trade solution, at least in a global perspective.
Well, given what we have already discussed in this lecture, it shouldn't be surprising that things are not that simple. The key objection to the OECD ranking is the holistic principle that we have discussed above, an analysis of the effects of isolated changes, even if econometrically sophisticated, is therefore misleading. In the case of the tariff, the most straightforward issue is the level of aggregation. Economic theory is in fact explicit on the conditions under which a tariff can be welfare enhancing. The presence of these conditions is frequently uncertain, which generalizes to the point we have made about the link between institutions and performance. In addition, there's the problem that the tariff as institution does not just come out of the blue, but is regularly a result of interest group lobbying. This is itself costly and therefore has to enter the comparison calculus. So we arrive at the same result as before. A third-person ranking of institutions along economic efficiency is impossible.
But where does that leave us? Are we relegated to the role of the historian who looks at events in a completely detached and neutral way?
Not necessarily. As we discussed in chapter 3, markets rely on certain normative standards, in particular freedom and voluntary exchange. If we accept these standards as a measuring rod for the quality of institutions, we can come up with procedural criteria, emphasizing the second-person view. The focus is on the extent to which institutions allow for participation of the concerned parties, especially of minority positions. We can concretize this to criteria such as explicit measures to give voice to concerned parties, policy support to empower these parties in terms of their social and human capital, freedom of processing and provision of information, and the presence of feedback mechanisms after policy implementation.
Of course, there is a trade-off here with the ability to come to decisions, avoiding mutual blockage of different interests. But the procedural rules that eventually regulate this would themselves be judged along the above criteria, referring to the constitutional stage that we have discussed before.
In our example of trade policies, this would mean that their frequent treatment as external diplomacy and a subsequent referral of important decisions to the domain of government activity is problematic. Instead, concerned voices should be heard and feedback mechanisms implemented based on decision procedures that are explicitly legitimated.
This finalizes our discussion of institutions. Let us now summarize what we have discussed.
We started by delineating institutions as rules from institutionalized behavior as regular patterns. As types of institutions, we distinguished between conventions, social norms, informal institutions, and formal institutions. Institutionalized behavior is always shaped by interactions among these types, even though one type can be more prominent than others. Therefore, institutional analysis must always follow a holistic principle.
We then looked at three key cognitive mechanisms underlying the emergence and stabilisation of institutions. The first is induction, based on the Gestalt principle. The second is the formation of hypotheses based on abduction. And the third is the categorization and institutionalization of behavior. These cognitive mechanisms causally connect with embodied cues and signs in the environment.
Those mechanisms must be complemented by the role of emotions, part of which are biologically rooted. We saw that emotions strongly influence the following of institutions and the interplay between the four categories, including their sanctioning mechanisms.
The performativity of institutions refers to the connection between identity in the institutions, resulting in internalized behavior and the formation of types of agents relating to certain institutional contexts, shaped by the processes of self-selection.
We then synthesized these elements into a general circular model of institutions following Aoki. This model analyzes institutions in two dimensions: the cognitive and behavioral dimension, and on two levels, the individual and population level. Again, a key role is played by public signs that emerge endogenously as a constituent of the institution.
Institutional evolution is strongly path-dependent. A key implication is that measures of institutional efficiency are endogenous. This results from the complex interaction between economic transaction cost, as determined by institutions, and the political transaction cost of creating and maintaining institutions. On both levels, a world free of transaction cost is logically impossible and therefore cannot form a valid analytical point of reference. This includes the constitutional level and the construct of a hypothetical social contract.
Based on this, we then turned to the relation between institutions, power, and violence. Institutions shape the distribution of agential power in the market, most prominently in the form of property rights. But the eventual impact on institutionalized behavior is always mediated by endogenous forces in social networks.
The enforcement of institutions, apart from pure conventions, is ultimately determined by violent action. Therefore, social arrangements regulating violence between different groups impact on institutional evolution, as institutions determine the extent and forms in which rents can be appropriated by elites that control means of violence.
Finally, we discussed different approaches to evaluating institutions. We saw that the ranking of institutions along their economic efficiency from a third person's point of view is not possible for principal reasons. The alternative is to focus on procedural criteria based on the values of freedom and voluntary exchange.
This brings us to the end of this lecture. and as well a series of chapters that have developed a very broad framework for economics as the science of markets, ecology and evolution, specialization and cooperation, production and technological evolution, the individual agent, social networks, and finally institutions. If you made it until here and looking back, might think that our perspective often seemed to extend far beyond markets, you are not entirely wrong. But as we hope to show in the following chapters, there are rich rewards to be earned from such a perspective for now really going to the core of the modern market system, money and finance, evolutionary market analysis, economic fluctuations, international economics, inequality, and economic growth. Those will be the topics to which we turn in the next chapters. We look forward to having you there again. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.